The morning sun crept through the half-closed blinds of Dan Carter's modest house, casting long streaks of light across the worn wooden floor. The room smelled faintly of dust and stale coffee. Outside, the Arizona landscape stretched endlessly, barren and unforgiving, mirroring the emptiness Dan felt inside. His body ached as he pushed himself out of bed, the old injury in his leg flaring up as it did every morning. He winced, leaning on the edge of the bed for a moment before grabbing his cane and hobbling toward the kitchen. Dan's life had shrunk into a rigid routine. Breakfast was always the same, toast and eggs, eaten in silence while the news droned on in the background. He didn't really listen to it. The voices became a blur, like the rest of his existence. The walls of his house felt smaller each day, a suffocating reminder of the life he used to have. A decorated sergeant in the army, he'd once commanded respect and purpose. Now, at 40, he lived alone, haunted by memories he couldn't outrun. The scars on his body told part of the story. The jagged one across his chest from shrapnel, the limp in his leg from the bullet that had nearly taken it. But the deeper wounds were invisible, buried in his mind. Nights were the hardest. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, the screams of his comrades echoing in his ears. The nightmares always brought him back to that night in Afghanistan, the ambush that changed everything. His team had been caught in the crossfire, and 2 of his men didn't make it out. The guilt gnawed at him, a constant weight he carried like a second shadow. He had tried therapy, medications. None of it filled the void. His sister Ellen was the only person who still made an effort to reach him. She visited weekly, always bringing something, groceries, a casserole, or just her presence. Dan appreciated it, even if he couldn't always show it. But even Ellen couldn't understand the depth of his isolation. That morning, as he sat at the table with his untouched plate of food, the sound of her knock broke the stillness. He shuffled to the door, opening it to find her standing there, holding a bag of groceries and wearing the determined expression he had come to associate with her. "Morning, Dan," she said brightly, stepping past him into the kitchen. She set the bag down on the counter and turned to face him, hands on her hips. "You look like hell." "Thanks," he muttered, closing the door and leaning against it. She sighed, softening. "I'm worried about you. I know things have been hard, but you can't keep living like this." He didn't respond, just lowered himself into a chair, staring at the countertop. Ellen busied herself putting away the groceries, her movements purposeful. Finally, she turned to him, leaning against the counter. "I've been thinking," she said carefully. "There's this animal shelter in town. They've got dogs, some of them ex-military. I read about how they can help veterans with PTSD, maybe—" "No." Dan cut her off, his voice sharper than he intended. He looked away, clenching his fists. "I don't need a dog. I'm fine." Ellen didn't budge. "You're not fine, Dan, and you don't have to be alone in this. Dogs can help. They don't judge, and they don't ask questions. They're there." Dan shook his head, but her words lingered. He didn't want to admit it, but the thought of having someone, to share the silence with stirred a faint flicker of interest. Still, he pushed it down. "I'll think about it," he mumbled, hoping to end the conversation. Ellen smiled faintly. "That's all I'm asking." After she left, the house felt even quieter than usual. Dan sat on the couch, staring at the TV without really seeing it. His sister's words replayed in his mind, and despite himself, he found his curiosity growing. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he made a decision. The next day, he found himself standing outside the animal shelter, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. The building was small and unassuming, with a faded sign and chain-link fencing enclosing a yard where a few dogs milled about. The sound of barking greeted him as he stepped inside, the smell of disinfectant and damp fur filling the air. A young woman at the front desk looked up and smiled. "Can I help you?" Dan hesitated, unsure of what to say. I heard you've got dogs, military ones." Her expression softened. "We do. A few of them. Are you looking to adopt?" "I guess," he said gruffly. "Just want to take a look." She nodded and led him through the narrow aisles of kennels. Dan felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him as dogs barked, wagged their tails, or simply watched him pass. None of them sparked anything in him, until they reached the last row. In the farthest corner of a dimly lit kennel lay a German shepherd, his fur dull and patchy in places. One ear was torn, and a long scar ran along his side. He didn't react to their presence, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed. Something about him seemed familiar, but Dan couldn't place it at first. "That's Ranger," the woman said softly. "He's an ex-military dog. Was found abandoned a few months ago. He's a bit of a challenge. Doesn't trust people much anymore." Dan's heart skipped a beat. He stepped closer, gripping the bars of the kennel. "Ranger?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The dog lifted his head slightly, his gaze meeting Dan's. For a moment, Dan was transported back to Afghanistan, to the dusty base where Ranger had been his partner. The memories hit him like a tidal wave. The training, the missions, the nights they'd kept each other alive. He had thought Ranger was dead, lost in the ambush that had taken so much. But the eyes that stared back at him now were empty, devoid of the recognition and loyalty Dan remembered. Ranger didn't wag his tail or move toward him. He simply looked away, laying his head back down. "He doesn't recognize me," Dan murmured, a lump forming in his throat. He felt a stab of pain, like losing Ranger all over again. But then he straightened, his jaw tightening. He couldn't walk away. Not again. "I'll take him," he said firmly. The shelter worker hesitated. "Are you sure? He's been through a lot. It won't be easy." Dan nodded. "I'm sure." As he left the shelter with Ranger's leash in hand, the dog trotted beside him, his movements stiff and hesitant. Dan glanced down at him, his heart heavy with determination. He didn't know how long it would take, but he was going to bring Ranger back, for both their sakes. Ranger lay curled in the corner of Dan's living room, his body tense, his eyes warily scanning the room. The dog hadn't moved from that spot since they'd come home from the shelter. Dan watched him from across the room, sitting in his recliner with a beer in hand. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustle of Ranger shifting his position. Dan had set up a corner with everything the dog might need. A new bed, bowls of fresh food and water, and a toy he'd picked up on the way back. Ranger ignored all of it, his gaze fixed on the walls, as though bracing for some invisible threat. The sight of the dog's nervous posture was like a mirror for Dan's own unease. He took a deep breath, rubbing his hand over his face. "It's just you and me now, buddy," he said softly, though he didn't expect a response. Ranger didn't even flick an ear. Dan sighed and leaned back, letting his thoughts wander. Memories flooded in uninvited. Afghanistan, the missions they'd shared, the way Ranger would dart ahead, his body taut with focus as he searched for threats. He had been fearless, a lifeline in the chaos. Seeing him now, so withdrawn and defeated, was a stark reminder of how much had changed. The first night was restless. Dan woke from a nightmare, his chest heaving, his shirt damp with sweat. He sat up, the darkness pressing in around him, but as his breathing slowed, he noticed something, a shadow near the bedroom door. Ranger lay there, his body still, his eyes watching Dan intently. It wasn't the closeness Dan had hoped for, but it was something. "Couldn't sleep either, huh?" Dan murmured. Ranger didn't move, but Dan felt the faintest flicker of connection. The next morning, Dan decided to try engaging Ranger in small ways. He poured food into the dog's bowl and set it down a few feet away, then sat nearby with a cup of coffee. Ranger didn't move until Dan left the room, and only then did the faint sound of crunching break the silence. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. Ranger ate only when Dan wasn't watching, drank water in secret, and returned to his corner like a soldier retreating to a bunker. Dan tried talking to him, keeping his voice low and steady, recounting stories from their time in the field. It felt strange, speaking to someone who gave no sign of listening, but it was better than silence. "You remember that patrol in Kandahar?" Dan asked one evening, sitting cross-legged on the floor near Ranger's corner. "You found that IED before we even knew it was there. Saved all our asses that day." He chuckled softly. "Smartest damn dog I ever met." Ranger's gaze shifted slightly toward Dan, but the moment was fleeting. The dog's eyes were still clouded as though a barrier of fear kept him from fully acknowledging his former partner. As the days turned into weeks, Dan began to notice small changes. Ranger started following him with his eyes, tracking his movements through the house. Once, Dan dropped his cane and the clatter startled the dog. But instead of retreating to his corner, Ranger stood his ground, his ears twitching. It wasn't much, but it was progress. The breakthrough came one evening when Dan retrieved an old box from his garage. Inside were remnants of his time in the military, a faded uniform, a few medals, and a worn rubber ball that had been Ranger's favorite. He held the ball for a long moment, the texture bringing back a flood of memories. "Let's see if you remember this," he said, stepping out into the backyard. Ranger followed reluctantly, his movements cautious. Dan knelt in the grass and placed the ball on the ground between them. "Go on, buddy," he urged. "It's yours." The dog's ears perked up slightly and he sniffed the air, his nose twitching. For a brief moment there was a spark of recognition. Ranger stepped forward, his body stiff, and lowered his head to sniff the ball, but then, as though the memories were too much, he pulled back and retreated to the edge of the yard. Dan sighed, the weight of disappointment settling over him. He picked up the ball and sat on the porch, turning it over in his hands. "It's okay," he said, more to himself than the dog. "We'll get there." That night, Dan's sleep was interrupted by a sound he hadn't heard before. Soft, hesitant footsteps echoed in the quiet house. He opened his eyes and saw Ranger standing at the foot of the bed, his head tilted slightly as he watched Dan. The sight brought a lump to Dan's throat. "Hey, buddy," he said quietly. Ranger didn't move, but he didn't leave either. It was the first time the dog had willingly entered Dan's space. The following day, Dan decided to take another step. He picked up the leash he'd bought and approached Ranger slowly. The dog eyed him warily but didn't back away. "Let's go for a walk," Dan said, his voice calm. It took a few minutes of coaxing, but Ranger eventually let Dan clip the leash onto his collar. The walk was tense at first. Ranger kept his body low, his ears swiveling at every sound. Dan noticed the way the dog flinched at passing cars and avoided looking at people. They stayed close to the house, circling the block in silence. By the time they returned, Ranger seemed exhausted, his tail drooping. Dan knelt beside him, gently patting his side. "You did good, Ranger. Real good." The days that followed were marked by more small victories. Ranger began approaching Dan during meals, sitting a few feet away as if testing the waters. He started sniffing at the toys Dan left out, occasionally nudging them with his nose. One evening, Dan threw the rubber ball across the yard again. This time, Ranger followed it with his eyes, though he didn't move to retrieve it. It was enough to give Dan hope. "You're getting there, buddy," Dan said as they sat on the porch together, the sun dipping below the horizon. "One step at a time." That night, for the first time, Ranger lay down beside Dan's bed. The space between them, both physical and emotional, felt smaller than it had in weeks. Dan fell asleep with a faint smile, his dreams less haunted than before. The morning sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the small living room where Ranger lay sprawled on the rug. His posture was more relaxed now, his legs stretched out and his breathing steady. For the first time in weeks, Dan felt a flicker of hope as he sipped his coffee, watching the dog from the kitchen. Progress was slow, but it was there. They were beginning to move forward, one careful step at a time. Dan had spent the previous night sorting through a box of memories stashed in his garage, a weathered wooden crate filled with his military belongings. Inside were the fragments of a life he'd tried to leave behind, medals for bravery, photographs of his team, and Ranger's old training gear. The sight of the rubber ball they used during missions had brought a bittersweet smile to his face. This morning he carried the ball out to the backyard, Ranger trotting behind him. The dog's movements were still cautious, but there was a noticeable difference. His tail no longer stayed tucked under his body, and his ears were less tense. Dan knelt on the grass, holding the ball in his hands. "All right, partner," he said softly, his voice steady. "Let's see if you remember this." He tossed the ball a few feet away, watching Ranger's reaction carefully. At first, the dog froze, his eyes locked on the object. Then, as though a distant memory stirred within him, Ranger took a tentative step forward. His nostrils flared as he sniffed the air, inching closer to the ball. Dan held his breath, willing himself to stay patient. Finally, Ranger picked up the ball with his mouth, his movements hesitant but deliberate. He turned back toward Dan, his tail wagging ever so slightly. The sight of it made Dan's heart swell. "Good boy," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "That's my Ranger." Over the next few days, they worked on rebuilding the connection they once had. Dan used the old commands they'd practiced during their service, simple words like sit, stay, and fetch. At first, Ranger was slow to respond, as though he were testing whether it was safe to trust again. But with each successful attempt, the spark in his eyes grew brighter. One evening, Dan brought out something he hadn't touched in years, his military whistle. It was small, scratched from years of use, but it still worked. He gave 2 short blows, the same pattern he'd used during missions to call Ranger back to him. The dog's ears perked up immediately, his body snapping to attention. Dan could see the internal struggle playing out in Ranger's mind, the pull of instinct against the weight of his fear. "It's okay, buddy," Dan said gently. "Take your time." After a long pause, Ranger moved toward him, stopping a few feet away. He dropped the ball at Dan's feet and sat down, his gaze meeting Dan's for the first time in what felt like forever. There was something in Ranger's eyes that hadn't been there before, a glimmer of recognition, of trust. Dan felt his chest tighten with emotion, but he forced himself to stay calm. "That's my boy," he whispered, reaching out to scratch Ranger behind the ears. For the first time, the dog didn't flinch. Their walks around the neighborhood became longer and more purposeful. Ranger started walking closer to Dan, his body less rigid, his head held higher. They ventured into the local park one afternoon where Dan let Ranger off the leash for the first time. The dog hesitated, glancing back at Dan as if seeking permission. "Go on," Dan encouraged, his voice soft but firm. "You're free." Ranger took off at a slow trot, sniffing the ground and exploring the open space. Dan watched him closely, his heart pounding with both pride and nervousness. When Ranger finally turned and ran back toward him, tail wagging, Dan let out a relieved laugh. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. At home, Ranger began following Dan from room to room, his presence a quiet comfort. One evening, as Dan sat on the couch flipping through an old photo album, Ranger climbed up beside him, resting his head on Dan's lap. The gesture was so unexpected that Dan froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. Then he gently placed a hand on the dog's head, stroking his fur in slow, calming motions. "You remember, don't you?" Dan murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You remember everything." That night, as they sat together on the porch, Dan stared out at the horizon, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. Ranger lay at his feet, his body relaxed, his eyes half closed. The silence between them was comfortable, a stark contrast to the heavy quiet that had once filled the house. Dan reached down, scratching Ranger's ears. "We've come a long way, buddy," he said softly, "and we're not done yet." The next morning, Dan decided to recreate one of their old training routines. He set up an obstacle course in the backyard using old crates and rope, lining the path with markers. Ranger watched from the porch, his head tilted in curiosity. "Come on, Ranger," Dan called, motioning for the dog to join him. "Let's see what you've got." At first, Ranger approached the course hesitantly, sniffing each obstacle before attempting to navigate it. Dan guided him with quiet commands, offering encouragement at every step. By the end of the session, Ranger was moving through the course with confidence, his tail wagging as he completed the final hurdle. Dan knelt beside him, ruffling his fur. "You're still the best damn partner I've ever had." In the weeks that followed, their bond grew stronger. Ranger began responding to Dan's whistle instantly, his movements sharp and purposeful. The dog who had once cowered in the corner now greeted Dan at the door with a wagging tail and bright eyes. One evening, Dan found an old photograph of the two of them from their days in Afghanistan. In the picture, they stood side by side, both covered in dust but wearing matching expressions of determination. Dan placed the photo on the table next to his bed, a reminder of how far they'd come. As the days turned into months, Dan and Ranger settled into a new routine. Their shared pain had forged a deeper connection, one built on trust and understanding. They were no longer just a man and his dog. They were partners, survivors, and friends. One morning, as they sat on the porch watching the sunrise, Dan looked down at Ranger, who lay peacefully at his side. "We've still got a lot of life left in us, don't we, boy?" he said with a smile. Ranger thumped his tail in response. For the first time in years, Dan felt a sense of peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they would face them together. Thank you for watching this story of resilience and connection. If it touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Explore our other videos for more inspiring journeys, and feel free to share this one with friends and family who might need a spark of hope today.